Good morning, everybody. My name is I'm really sorry to break up your conversations. It's the hardest bit of my job, breaking up rich, educationally rich, I'm sure, conversations going on in the room at our events. My name's Nick Hillman. I'm director of the Higher Education Policy Institute, which is an Oxford-based think tank. We're very, very honoured indeed to be able to help the OECD launch Education at a Glance alongside Cambridge University Press and Assessment, who are other hosts for today. Well done to you for making it through to the event, given it's been a bit like carrying on up the Khyber organising this event, because we had Catherine McKinnell, the Education Minister, due to speak, confirmed on Friday at lunchtime. 2 hours later, she was reshuffled out of government. And then we had, obviously, the tube strike that we were all hoping would be cancelled happen. So well done for making it through. It does mean that we have significantly more people watching online than we have in the room. So this is a hybrid event. And when it comes to the Q&A, we will look to take questions from people online as well as people in the room, and welcome to you if you're watching online, as well as welcome to you if you're here in the room. It's a huge honour to publish this report, because I think it is literally, or not published, to be involved with Andreas and the OECD's launch of the report, because it is the most detailed, the most useful educational report that comes out anywhere in the world each year, because it's a really detailed, as we'll hear from Andreas, comparative study across the developed world. It is also the worst named title in education, because it's called Education at a Glance, and you cannot glance at it. You know, it needs to be digested slowly over a period of many months, because it is really a very, very, very rich compendium. So I'm going to get straight down to business, because we've got a lot to do, and Andreas has a flight later, so we are going to have to keep to time, and the Minister is only here for the time she can be available for. So I'm going to be pretty strict on time. First, we're going to hear from our co-hosts today, Cambridge University Press and Assessments. I'm about to hand over to Pamela Baxter, who's Managing Director of IELTS there. I'll let her say more about what she does. And then we're going to go to Andreas Schleicher, who's Director of Education and Skills at the OECD in Paris, though you all know that because he's been doing that job for a long time. And as I said to a journalist this morning, I honestly, genuinely think Andreas knows more about education around the world than any other living person. So we're very, very honoured to be able to host him. And indeed, he's the only person ever who has delivered the HEPI annual lecture twice. And you can find copies. There's some hard copies, actually, of one of those lectures floating around today. But you can find copies on our website. And then after we've heard from Andreas, there'll be a very brief opportunity to put any sort of specific questions to Andreas about his presentation. And then we will move to a panel, and I'll introduce the panellists at that point. We've got expertise from the college sector, from the university sector, from the school sector. And Andreas will be part of that panel, as well as will Pamela. And I hope that bit will be really participatory and give you plenty of opportunity to put your questions to the panellists. So with no further ado, obviously I've already mentioned the Minister. We've also very honoured to have Jackie Smith speaking, given that she was a last-minute stand-in, and indeed her responsibilities broadened over the weekend because she got a job in the DWP as well as her existing job in the DFE. I know she's very pushed for time, as ministers always are, but we will be hearing from the Minister as well, who hopefully, I'm hoping she'll tell us when the white paper will be out, and I'm hoping she'll tell us exactly what the new machinery of government changes mean for higher education and skills, but we'll find out. So, with no further ado, over to you, Pamela.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you all for joining us, tube strike notwithstanding. So I'm Pamela Baxter. I'm Chief Product Officer at Cambridge University Press and Assessment, where I'm also Managing Director for IELTS Cambridge. And it's really wonderful to be here today supporting the launch of Education at a Glance 2025 report. And today's event really feels like a happy alignment of outlooks and interests. HEPI sets the benchmark in its insights for higher education policy in the UK. We at Cambridge are very proud to be members of HEPI. And the OECD sets the benchmark in its insights into country-level policy on key issues, ranging from government to health and, of course, education. At Cambridge, we're immensely proud of our collaboration with the OECD, including the joint development of a foreign language assessment with PISA, the OECD's Programme for International Student Assessment. With a global footprint in the worlds of education and assessment, it feels very appropriate for Cambridge University Press and Assessment to be supporting today's launch. And it gives me really great pleasure to welcome Andreas Schleicher here, who's well known to so many of you here and to us at Cambridge as well. And we're looking forward to hearing from you shortly. The OECD's mission, Better Policies for Better Lives, is consistent with the mission of the University of Cambridge to contribute to society through the pursuit of education, learning, and research at the highest international levels of excellence. Although I have to say, I think that OECD did a much better job at condensing it all down. In a world flooded with information and disinformation, the OECD is uniquely placed to produce internationally comparative data that allows policymakers to measure their country's achievements and set their standards against the best international practice. The annual publication of Education at a Glance has become a touchstone for anybody involved in education policy. It's true that we can only improve what we can measure. And so for that reason alone, Education at a Glance is an essential tool for improving our education systems. It's a snapshot and a report card telling us what we're doing well and where there's room for improvement. And there's some really excellent news in this report, not least its unequivocal statement of support for the importance of tertiary education. At a time when the value of higher education is being questioned, it's essential to be armed with the evidence to make the strongest possible case for tertiary education as a means to strengthen social mobility. It's great to read that educational attainment has steadily increased over decades across all OECD countries, and that with 48% of young adults holding a tertiary qualification, it's higher than ever. This puts hard data to what everyone here instinctively knows. Tertiary education is associated with higher employment rates, better wages, and better health. It should fill us with hope to learn that more younger people than ever are pursuing tertiary education. Yet, as the report states, governments in OECD countries still have some homework to do. We are told, for instance, that completion rates of young adults going into tertiary education are low, particularly among men, with less than half of new entrants finishing their programs within the expected duration. Wearing my IELTS hat, I was especially pleased to read about the continued growth of international mobility in OECD countries, with the number of mobile students as a proportion of student numbers more than doubling over the past decade. And I'm sure all of us in this room, it is heartening to see in the OECD's country report that the UK continues to be one of the most attractive destinations for international students, second only to the US. These trends are not only reshaping global higher education, but are of strategic importance for countries that welcome these mobile students. This is something that we at Cambridge are profoundly aware of, and it's why we see it as one of our responsibilities to make sure that those globally mobile students seeking paths to tertiary education are equipped with the right skills to enable them to thrive. But enough about Cambridge, on to today's event. Thank you again to Nick and HEPI for hosting us. Thank you to Andreas for travelling across the channel to launch the global and country reports. Thank you to Baroness Smith for being able to support us, and I look forward to joining the other panellists later. But right now, over to Andreas Schleicher. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela and Nick, and also for your amazing support during all these years for our work. You know, Education at a Glance used to be at a glance when it started, simply because we didn't have much to report on. It was very, very hard to get comparative data, but things have improved thanks to many great colleagues around the world helping us to better measure outcomes. I'm not going to talk about just higher education, nor is this publication just about higher education. It's very important for us at the OECD that we cover education from the earliest stage in life through learning in adulthood, because that's where the tough trade-offs and choices often lie. Are you going to invest in strong foundations for the smallest? Are you going to invest in upskilling and reskilling for those who work? Those are really, really difficult choices, and it's important to see education as a whole. But of course, I'm going to put the emphasis on higher education, where clearly we see a lot of movement. It's actually quite amazing. 10, 20 years ago, who would have thought, 40% of young people get into college and complete it? No. And some people say, well, maybe one day everybody gets a college degree and ends up working for the minimum wage. We see a deflation in the labor market value of skills. But we haven't seen that. We have actually seen that demand for advanced skills is increasing in many countries faster than supply. 100 years ago, we asked ourselves the same question about school. How many people do you actually want to complete high school? Later on, we understood, well, actually, if you do not have a high school degree, you face huge penalties in the modern workforce. And, we see similar kind of discussions now in higher education or tertiary education. But there are also important question marks. What do you say if, more people get more degrees, but we don't see increases in the skills of people? I think those are the areas to look at. I start with, the first important finding. We see that employment for tertiary graduates remains strong. That is true for the UK, but you can see that differential even more pronounced in many countries of the world. So getting a degree is a good insurance of against employment. And it varies by what you study, sure, but overall that is very important. We also see that tertiary qualifications provide good, earnings advantage. And once again, that earnings advantage is not diminishing despite the increase in participation rates. Now, it varies, if you go to countries like, Chile, Costa Rica, South Africa, there's just a huge scarcity of highly qualified people, so the relative earnings are high. So you can't relate those numbers directly to, the quality of higher education, because it's always demand and supply working in tandem here. You can look at PhDs. They also often are a big boost for earnings, not as much in the UK as elsewhere, but overall you can say, PhD adds quite a bit of advantage to a master's level still. And that is driving participation. No? You can see when you compare figures from 2019 to 24 in virtually every country, a lot has been added. You can say up to 21, we added about, over the last 30 years, 1% every year, and then nowadays it's a little bit less. But these are still impressive increases, all in most systems around the world. And as I said, just show you the data for that the earnings advantage has been pretty stable. On average across countries, that's the gray line, and in the UK, that's the pink line here. So at this moment, getting an advanced skill is still a really great investment that you can make as an individual, even despite high levels of tuition. I'm going to come to that. It depends what you study. The earnings benefits, what you can see, you go to a STEM-related field, that's generally the field that gets you the best relative earnings. When you get, arts, humanities, that comes out at the bottom, and you can see in the UK that differential is actually much bigger than in many other systems. And then in the middle, you have, business and health and welfare and so on. But, there's interesting, some exceptions. You go to Slovenia or Austria, they put a premium on health, health-related professions with good earnings. But so it matters what you study, and perhaps this is an area where, higher education could do better to give young people better signals, what investment is going to pay what returns. I think we're seeing that often. When you survey 15-year-olds, their aspirations are not very well aligned with the real job opportunities. And in fact, particularly individuals from disadvantaged background have often a quite myopic view on the future opportunities. I'm going to come to that. So I think there is something, societies could probably do to adjust those kinds of things. I want to still talk about the other end of the spectrum. That's also quite important. You can see in the UK, but virtually in all countries, we have a still significant minority of young people who do not get to the threshold of, an advanced education. That's basically those who do not complete 5 good GCSEs or equivalent vocational education qualifications. We call it upper secondary levels now, and you can see that is still, a non-negligible part, between 10, 20, in some cases over 40%, and they pay a very high price for this. And I say this because in the UK, the price for low qualifications has actually risen. At the top end, get good earnings premium. If you do not get to this, baseline qualification, you actually see a rising kind of premium. Now, that's on the next slide. Here, you can see the UK is the country where that penalty is actually largest among all countries for which we have comparative data. That may be a skills effect, it may be a signaling effect, but it's something I think to watch out for. We also see, and that's not a good finding for the UK, that those who are not in education and not in employment, we call them NEETs. It is still a significant share, and you look at the figures from 2019 and 24, you could see they have been rising in this country. Now, so we see on the one hand, some people with great benefits, great education. At the other end of the spectrum, we can see that kind of polarization. The tough question is always, how do we share the costs and benefits of advanced skills? Should this be paid by individuals? Should this be paid by taxpayers? What are the arrangements for that? And I think that's a very important question. When you look at the split between public and private education, you can see this is also an area where the UK is now at one extreme. In principle, I would still say the approach that the UK takes of income contingent loan systems is still probably your best bet to expanding access to higher education. Now, that's the only thing that you can scale. If you rely totally on public money, it's very, very hard. Now, but at the same time, you could say maybe the balance is tipped too far in that direction of limited public engagement in this, because we also see in 2015 things still look better than they looked in 22, for which we have the latest data. So, that is always a contentious issue, public-private share, but you could argue in the UK it's now at a quite pronounced position, and that explains why tuition levels are high. We have basically, Lithuania, England, and the UK is a quite distinct group in asking people to pay for higher education with a lot of differences. I would say, England has probably the most advanced approach. It's the risk for young people to get into higher education is quite low through the income contingent loan system. In the United States, where you largely get commercial loans, you probably get the money back. Can pay the money back if you succeed, but if not, so that is an issue. And in Lithuania, you're pretty much on your own. And we see that on the next slide, where you can see actually on the one hand, tuition levels, and then you see on the horizontal axis the share of students who get some form of government support, and that is, I think, very, very strong in the system here. Nevertheless, it's something to watch out for. Now, what I hear a lot in the discussion in England these days is, well, there's not enough money left for universities. Things have become more expensive, internationalization is maybe not proceeding as rapidly, so the financial situation of universities is tough. But, and that's the great thing, when you look at yourself through an international lens, these things are all relative. If you actually look at expenditure per student, you add up, public and private investment, the UK comes third after Luxembourg, the US, and number 3. So overall, you can actually say the total investment per student in a university in the UK is very good, despite, the pressures under which higher education financing is. And I like, when you take issue with money in higher education, I'd like you just to keep in mind that, for most other systems, it would look a lot worse. The question, of course, is, how do we reconcile equality of opportunity with, mobilizing resources? Now, you want the most talented and most motivated to get the best places, not the wealthiest. No? And we have new data for the first time on that, comparing that, which are quite, interesting. When you look at, if you have at least one parent with a college degree, university degree, you get a fairly good chance in virtually every country to get a college degree yourself, 70%. No? There's actually very little variation across countries in the chance to get a college degree if you have well-educated parents. No? But if you don't, the picture looks very different. No? And I must actually say the UK, or England here in this case, is at the stronger end of the spectrum. No? If your parents are not well-educated, you still have an almost 40% chance of getting a university degree, and that's, a good position after Denmark, Korea, Ireland, New Zealand, and Canada. In, the Slovak Republic, Lithuania, Hungary, you talk about, 5-6% of people. Now, in the Slovak Republic, the chance is 1 to 10. So in that sense, equality of opportunity is a huge issue, including in England, but at the same time, it is a lot better than it is in many other countries. And that also tells us that it's not just tuition. The big barriers, you can see many tuition-free countries here which have huge social disparities, including, my own country, Estonia, Austria. So it's not tuition no tuition that guarantees you free access. There's a lot to do with the student support systems that you have in universities. There's a lot to do with the guidance systems. A lot to do with how you finish with school and so on. So it's actually something really to think about. But clearly, on balance, that is, I would say, the most disappointing finding from this edition overall, that in many countries it's still the wealthiest, privileged, who get the best places, not the most talented and most motivated. Completion varies a lot across countries. England gets the second place after Ireland. You can say almost 70% of people complete their studies on time. That's a really good number. Here on the right side, you can see countries where it's 1 in 10. If you add a little bit of time, you can say 1 year or 3 years. The numbers get better everywhere, but still, we see that completion is very, very mixed. No? And in general, you can say systems with tuition do better. If you have to think about, I'm going to pay another £9,000 if I add another year, you think twice, whereas in countries where this is not a constraint, you may prolong your studies. So efficiency, completion, also is probably due to the UK offering a more structured approach to higher education than in many systems. In many systems, you have to figure out a lot yourself, what you study, how you study, combine your courses. In England, that's pretty much set for you. And all of those things could add up that actually completion rates are good, including completion for disadvantaged. Pamela, you already said international student mobility. And what's interesting, you're of course right, the United States is good in absolute terms, but that's only because it's a large country. Actually, if you look on this chart, you have to go pretty far down the line until you even find the United States. The United States has really lost out on internationalization over the last years. The countries that have gained are largely on the left side. And the UK is a good example, but Australia, Canada, Austria, Switzerland. It's interesting. It's no longer just the English-speaking countries. In the past, English was really the gateway to higher education. Now you can see actually Czech Republic, Slovak Republic, Hungary, they are actually very successful in internationalization. But some of the traditional leaders, United States have really dropped very, very far behind on this in relative terms. No? Of course, if you look at the size of the country, but then you can look at India or China and say, well, they're very successful. But what counts for us is really the share of international students, and that's where I think the UK remains a very attractive place to study. However, it's very much dependent on students from Asia, like many of the countries that are very attractive, whereas students from other world regions are much less well represented. That can be a choice of universities, but it's something to watch out. I alluded to already at the beginning, getting a qualification does not necessarily align with skills. And one of the things that is really troubling is that the share of adults that have very, very low skills. That red bar is basically people who cannot read as well as what you expect from a 10-year-old child. It's really very elementary reading skills, and you can see we're talking about, almost 1 in 5. And there are countries where that share is larger than the share with, good and highly skilled people. And you'll be surprised. You find even people with a tertiary qualification in that group of low skilled. You'd think these are all people, who haven't completed school. No, not at all. This is actually a good mix. What is also concerning is that people without baseline qualifications, I showed you at the beginning the earnings penalties you pay for that, but we've seen a big drop in those skills. It really is another illustration of the increasing polarization that we see in skills supply that I think we really need to watch out for. And then when you look at this across countries, here you see in every country people with a tertiary degree are more highly skilled than people with a high school degree. In this case, we looked at literacy, but you get similar pictures when you look at numeracy or problem-solving skills. But when you look at this across countries, you can see, for example, a Finnish high school graduate has pretty much the same skills as an English university graduate, college graduate. And that's true for many countries. So there's lots of variability in this. And our systems need to get better to signal the skills of people. At the moment, degrees and qualifications are still quite lumpy. They're very, very hard to navigate. And when you actually break that down by skill levels, you get a very, very different picture. You also see, and I think that's a kind of paradox that we still do not know how to crack, that in the case of England, the skills of adults have been pretty flat. Degrees are rising. How do we interpret this? Are those skills not measuring what university wants to be about, or do we see a kind of inflation of degrees? But if, then why don't we see that in the earnings of people? There are lots of really important questions, but I would say, we should look at that. The other point I want to make is, higher education is, by many, still associated with young people completing degrees. The future of tertiary education is very much about upskilling and reskilling. That's where the big demand is going to be. The faster our economies change, the more you need people who, continue to learn. And the overall picture on that is not very good. The first thing that you can see is that participation very much depends on your initial skills. You can see in England or elsewhere that if you don't do well at your skill levels, you're unlikely to invest in education and training. If you have advanced skill levels, that's the blue dot, you're much more likely to participate. And in one way, you can say those who need it most get the least of continuing education and training. Those who are highly skilled continue to upgrade their skills. And it's a pattern that is not everywhere the same. You look at Norway, that's doing a lot better than other countries. And we know why. I mean, they have just an amazing upskilling and reskilling system that is very well integrated into labor markets. But in most countries, those patterns are big. If you summarize this, you can see, women are a bit more likely than men to continue to learn, but the difference is not big. Then age is a huge factor. Older people who would need it most participate the least. Younger participate much more. Education, I already talked about that. The more educated you are, the more likely you participate in adult learning. And then last but not least, the people who are out of the labor force, again, you want to upskill them, to reintegrate them. This is really, really hard. You can't reach them very well because we know that much of the effective, continuing education and training happens at the workplace. And that brings me to The next aspect, work-based learning. This is where, despite, all your focus on apprenticeships and skills, I would still say the UK has a long way to go to, you can see even, in part, the apprenticeships being shifted more to advanced education. At the baseline levels, we see actually a drop when you look at 2013 and 23 figures. And I think that's something, there are countries here on the left side, Denmark, Ireland, Austria, Germany, that are much stronger position. I do want to come to the other end of the spectrum, early childhood education and care. And overall, you can say still that the UK is behind much of the rest, but it's a country with the most significant improvement. I think it really is a success story. You compare the last 10 years, you can see actually there's a really good increase in early childhood education and care. Also, we see a good shift from, access to quality and from care to education that used, it used to be largely a care industry, and you can see, in staff qualifications and so on, a much greater emphasis on education. But as you see, most countries are moving fast on this, and in many countries, 3 to 5-year-olds, you see basically universal enrollment. We also see that different from tertiary education, where UK spends a lot per student, that's not true in the early years. No? Spending per child is actually quite low, and very much dependent on private money. No? And that's, if you say, well, we want to invest more in higher education, this is probably where public money is your best benefit. No? And it's, largely explained by, the low children to staff ratio. No? Very few teachers in the system, lots of staff, but actually the educated staff is still a quite low ratio. Let me conclude with a picture on the overall investment in education. We can see that the share of public money that goes into education varies a lot across systems. In most countries, social spending is much larger than education spending. We invest a lot more in the present and the past than we invest in the future. And in fact, in many countries, that is becoming a real dilemma, with the demographics pushing you to spend more on pensions and things like this. But it is a concern, the investment in the future to protect it. If you look at this in terms of, share of GDP invested in education, the UK comes second after Norway. Norway does better if you add early childhood education, but that's harder to compare across countries. So if you just look at the colored segments for, school to university, you can say actually there is no country other than Norway that puts more of a greater share of its national income into education. Of course, again, a lot of that money in your case comes from private sources. Now that's something to keep in mind. It hasn't changed very much. When we look at unit spending, we have seen a slight change in the demography, slight change in spending per student, but we haven't seen the big increases in spending per student that we have seen in the majority of countries over the last years. And, when you look at spending patterns, you can see in primary education, classes are quite large in the UK, but that's maybe not a bad thing, because your investment in better teachers, I think, is a good choice. And you can see that when you compare, for example, the student-staff ratio on the vertical axis and the class size here, how countries make very, very different choices on this. No? And I would say, it's a reasonable way of how the efficiency of spending. The last aspect is salaries of teachers. Everybody debates that, and in most systems, salaries of educators are not really competitive when you look at that in relation to workers with similar qualification. But overall, neither England nor Scotland do particularly badly on that. No? Actually, they do better than most other systems. Now, teachers in both systems are actually quite well paid relative to their peers, even though not as well as workers from other professions. Now, I can skip that. And teacher shortages, yeah, it's the last element. Also, that is an area where you can say, you know, the UK is not doing as badly as many other systems. Many other systems struggle much more now, even though, you know, turnover is very high. So overall, there you can see spending choices, and in a nutshell, you know, actually, you may not like to hear that, but I would say, you know, overall, higher education is better equipped in terms of money than the early years in the UK, and quite well by international standards. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Andreas. That was absolutely superb, as it always is. Baroness Smith has kindly arrived and will in a moment address us, but we've just got a couple of minutes to put any sort of, I guess, technical questions, anything about Andreas's slides, to him. Andreas will also be part of the panel, so we can discuss more general issues with Andreas then. I see, I think David had a question. So just particularly questions on Andreas's slides.
Thanks for a fantastic presentation, as always, Andreas. But I just wanted to come back to your figures for public spending on higher education, because just over the road is the Treasury. And it's very important, if they're listening in, to remind people that you're heading that side. And we had an email exchange after your last explanation. It says including R&D. Yeah. So when you're measuring public expenditure on higher education, you're counting all the public expenditure on R&D going into universities. And we do have an unusually high proportion of our science spend going to higher education. So that may well be, I think, if you agree, one of the factors pushing up the figure.
Yeah, it contributes to that, but actually the overall pattern, the UK, even if you exclude R&D spending, and we have a figure of that in the publication, England and in the UK would still rank high. Sort of, if you add public and private money going into the system per student, even without R&D, you get us to a good position in our countries.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Andreas. There's a question in the front row here.
I think you need the microphone.
Wait for the microphone, because we've got lots of people listening online as well.
From Tim O'Shea. Andreas, fabulous, absolutely fabulous presentation. But I was surprised to see how well Ireland was doing on some of the metrics for things like contextual up, given that it is like a very small country. And I was also surprised to see how badly a lot of the metrics in the United States, which is the biggest and most economically powerful country, is doing. And would you like to comment on how this, small countries like Ireland suddenly seem to do quite well? And is the decline, relative decline in the US recent, or has that been steadily happening?
Two interesting questions. I mean, first of all, if you discount Japan and maybe China, most actually high-performing systems are relatively small systems. They're just very agile. And Ireland is a good example. Ireland has, since the 1960s, silently actually improved the quality of its education services. It does well in student outcomes, it's improved access, improved equity, with relatively little spending. So the numbers for Ireland have been, steadily moving up, like they have, in other countries also in Northern Europe. About the United States, the slide has been visible for a long time, but it's been accelerating. We see that in part, it's reinforced by things that have nothing to do with education. It's harder to getting visa for people and so on. It's become incredibly expensive. I would say, the unregulated tuition system. You have in England a highly regulated tuition system, and that protects students in a way. In the United States, it's unregulated, so basically universities can extract whatever number they can get from young people. And since the benefits are always related to your lifetime earnings, not to the added value of the university itself, that becomes a very distorting mechanism. So, and that contributes to dropout. The only caveat I would make, on the question of dropout or non-completion in the US is that the US is not as, credentials oriented as UK or Europe. So in a way, for many young people, they do a little bit of college and they get still a good job without the kind of penalties that we have. So in a way, I think the system may be a bit more, flexible in that sense. But no, overall, the US, one reason why it won't see the increases that we have seen in countries here in the region, simply because it's a pipeline effect. The school performance, the US ranks now, among the 30s of the countries from which we have data, where we look at math and science performance in schools. So, with that pipeline, it's very, very hard to get enough input to future universities. So there's many factors, but it's, I think, the only thing that, we should, look at the United States. It's not been doing well in, adding skills anymore, but it has still the economy that is most sensitive to skills. So the US economy is incredibly good at extracting value from the skills of people. And if you have great skills, that's where you go to earn a good salary. And that has saved the economy for a long time. It's attracted lots of foreign talent, and it's, make really good use of the skills. And I think here in this part of the world, there's a lot we could do to make labor markets more responsive to skills and give people the chances they deserve.
Thank you so much, Andreas. There'll be more opportunity to put questions to Andreas in a moment, but maybe we could thank him one more time. Now it's my huge pleasure to introduce our Minister, the Minister for Skills, Baroness Smith. She doesn't need much in the way of introduction, of course, former Home Secretary as well, and indeed her purview was expanded over the weekend because she got a foot in the Department for Work and Pensions as well as her existing job in the DFE. So, and she was also, Jackie, we're incredibly grateful to you for doing this because originally we were due to have a different DFE minister and you stepped into the breach at the last moment. But we're absolutely delighted to have you and we're very eager to hear about how your new responsibilities might play out too. Many thanks.
Thank you, Nick, for that welcome. And yes, you're right. There has been, I think we could probably describe it as a certain amount of churn in government over recent days. So I'm delighted to be here, but just sorry that it will be a rather fleeting visit as I need to get back to deal with some of the sort of fallout of that. But I am very pleased to have the chance to be here today to hear, Andreas, at least the second half of your presentation. And there are some things on there that I hope I'll be able to respond to in my comments. And of course, to celebrate the fact that we're able here at the launch of the Education at a Glance 2025 publication to begin thinking about what we can learn from that, how we can use that comparative data. So thank you to Nick and HEPI for organising the event today, to Pamela Baxter from the Cambridge University Press and Assessment, and thank you, Andreas, for your continued leadership in bringing this really important comparative data to the forefront of our consideration. Events like this, as I say, bring us the opportunity to have the stimulating conversations, to celebrate our relative strengths, while of course also challenging ourselves to go further on those areas where we need the ambition to make the change that we want to see. And I know this is important because I have the opportunity as well in the department to travel and to talk to colleagues internationally. I was reflecting on the visit that I made to Japan and Malaysia earlier on in the summer, and also the conversations that I'm able to have with visiting international colleagues, and also, of course, at the G20 last year, where we are able to reflect on the power of high-quality comparative data to help us to focus on areas of learning that can strengthen our own systems whilst highlighting our own best practice. But of course, we also want to do that in the context of the objectives that we set ourselves as government. And we've been very clear in the Department for Education that an important role is leading the government's opportunity mission, our commitment to break down the barriers to opportunity for people throughout their lives, and to see learning and access to skills as a really important way in which we're able to do that. Because in practice, what that opportunity mission means is breaking the link between young people's background and their chance of success. We and Bridget Phillipson have been absolutely clear that for this government, every child and young person should have every opportunity to succeed, no matter who they are, where they come from, how much their parents earn, and that drives our focus from early years through to tertiary education. And whilst there are many findings to be proud of for us as a country, as a government in the Education at a Glance 2025 statistics, the findings launched today also help us to focus our attention on the areas that are most crucial to achieving that ambition. So, for example, this year's report reinforces, I think, the importance of the focus that as a department we have put onto early years. We have a key target now as part of the government's plan for change to improve the proportion of children who are ready for school at the point at which they arrive at the age of 5. And I think, Andreas, you were right to focus on the idea of that pipeline, because unless we're taking a long-term view and providing children with those chances from the very earliest point in their lives, we won't be able to make the change and provide the opportunity that we're determined to do. As we've seen in the UK, we do have a near universal enrolment in early childhood education from age 3, but we need to do more to support disadvantaged children, for example. And in order to support us in doing that, we've increased this year by 45% the early years pupil premium, translating to £570 per eligible child per year. We're expecting to spend £9 billion on early years entitlements in 2026-27, a large increase. That will support more parents, especially mothers, to balance family life and work, but it will also enable us to focus on the staff, the guidance, the training that will ensure that the experience that children are receiving preschool is high quality, as well as simply the care, important though that is. For me, I'm particularly interested in the data that you have produced around our comparative performance with respect to skills and vocational education. I'm absolutely clear that if we're going to deliver that opportunity mission, we need to ensure that our further education sector and our skills sector and the work that they do together is more at the heart of government than it has been perhaps previously. And of course, if we're going to grow our economy, which will be important for enabling our future investment in the education system, that is so crucial as well. And that's why we have already, I think, this year, refocused onto further education. It's why we'll have more to say about that in our post-16 skills and education white paper. It's why we're investing a further £590 million for colleges and other 16 to 19 providers in the 2025-26 financial year. That represents an increased and significant investment, but I know that there is a long way for us to go in supporting colleges and other 16 to 19 providers, particularly ensuring support for the teachers, recruitment and retention of the teachers that will make a difference to those young people who have particular need, both for the skills education that is being provided, but also for the opportunities, as you rightly identified, Andreas, to build their basic skills, to support them in the sort of education and skills that are going to be necessary for opportunity throughout their lives. And that is nowhere more clear than it is in terms of the challenge that we have with the number of young people not in training or education. That's a concern, I know, across Europe, but the report highlights that it is particularly acute in England and that recent years have seen a worsening trend here. It cannot be right either for the individual or for our society or for the economy that we need to build to be wasting the talent of young people, to be depriving them of the opportunity to make the most of their lives at the most crucial point in their working and adult lives. And that's why it's so important that we will focus more on that area, building on the Youth Guarantee Trailblazers that we've already committed to. And I know, in relation to my new role, where I'll be working still in the DFE on FE and HE, but also in the Department of Work and Pensions on the skills area of my portfolio, that Pat McFadden, the Secretary of State, when I was talking to him and he was talking to staff yesterday, is absolutely clear that being able to use our skills work alongside the labour market information that is obviously so much part of DWP's current work to drive opportunities for young people, to ensure that young people aren't left in that position with no education or training or employment, is an absolutely crucial priority. And I'm really glad to be able to be making those links to the labour market work, to the employment work that is happening in the Department of Work and Pensions, and ensuring that people are able to gain the skills that they need to move into good quality jobs and, of course, to support our workforce. And then finally, on the theme of higher education and global competitiveness, and thank you, David Willits, as always, for being a champion of higher education. This report, of course, provides valuable insights into, first of all, those entering the UK's world-class higher education. We're proud to be a leading destination for international students, with a market share of 15% amongst participating OECD countries. International students in the UK come for the high-quality higher education, the internationally recognised higher education that we offer, and in doing that, they support our higher education system, but the benefits go beyond that. They contribute significantly to our campuses, to the economy, as I've said, but also to the friendships formed, to the ideas exchanged, to the futures shaped that students being able to work alongside each other gives. And we will remain committed to welcoming genuine high-calibre international students to study in the UK and ensuring that our higher education system continues to be world class. And in order to be able to do that, of course, we need to maintain the challenge for reform and improvement that we've already begun to spell out, and we will have more to say in the white paper and in the coming weeks and months, because we do in this country ask students to make a considerable investment alongside the investment made by government. And for that reason, it's absolutely crucial that we can, and we're encouraged by the figures about access to higher education, Andreas, but we want to go further to make sure that anybody in this country who could benefit from a higher education and who wants to receive it is able to have that benefit. And that means challenging ourselves as government and challenging the sector to do more on the access, participation and experience that students receive, as well as driving out poor quality where we see it and encouraging all to be improving quality in our already excellent higher education system. But of course, as I've suggested, the report also highlights areas where we need to improve, such as the figures around teacher retention. Driving improvement and excellence for all children in our schools is fundamentally linked to the quality and quantity of teachers who can deliver that education. It's the key factor in making a difference to the quality of education that we can offer. And as you've identified, in England, 9.5% of teachers left the profession in the 2021-22 academic year. And we're committed to addressing those challenges head on and working to drive positive change, to make teaching the well-rewarded, well-supported profession that I know from my 11 years in teaching it needs to be, and that our children and our country need. And that's why we've committed to recruiting 6,500 more teachers. It's why we're working hard to reverse that trend of teachers leaving the profession, which is why for 25-26 we announced a 4% pay award for school teachers and leaders, accepting in full the school teacher review, pay review body's recommendation. Combined with the previous year's 5.5% award, this will mean school teachers will see an increase in their pay of almost 10% over 2 years. And alongside that, our targeted retention incentives will ensure that in those areas where it is most challenging to get the teachers that we need in maths, physics, chemistry and computing, for example, and for those who choose to work in disadvantaged schools, we will additionally support them to come into teaching and to stay in teaching. So thank you once again, Andreas and the OECD and Nick and Pamela for today's event, for the opportunity for us, as I say, to compare, to contrast, to celebrate, but also to challenge ourselves. And I'm sure in the conversations that will follow, that will be an important theme. And thank you for enabling us to do that.
Well, thank you, Jackie, once again, and thank you for squeezing this into your diary. I know you have to dash. Just before you do, will the machinery of government changes slow down the publication of the white paper you mentioned? Do you think,
I very much hope not, Nick.
Great. Brilliant. Well, thank you once again.
Cheers.
If I could ask the panellists to come up, they know who they are, and I will introduce them as they're coming to the panel. We have a very rich panel, as I said at the very start. So we have Professor Becky Francis, who's just first up on the stage here, who many of you will know. She's the boss, it doesn't matter where you sit, anyway you like, the boss of the Education Endowment Fund, Foundation rather, and former director of UCL's Institute of Education. But perhaps even more pertinently for this conversation, she is currently doing the curriculum and assessment review for the government and will be reporting, well, hopefully she'll reveal, I'm not sure when. Not sure she will reveal, but reporting fairly soon. And Becky is incredibly experienced in the schools and curriculum and pretty much every aspect of education, if I'm honest. And we've got David Hughes at the end here, who is the CEO of the AOC, the Association of Colleges, so very powerful voice for the colleges. He was previously CEO of the Learning and Work Institute, and before that he was at the Skills Funding Agency, so he knows this terrain incredibly well. Next to me, I've got Professor Sir Chris Husbands, who was Vice-Chancellor of Sheffield Hallam University from 2016 to 2023. He was also Chair of the TEF, the Teaching Excellence Framework, from 2017 to 2023, and most importantly, from my perspective, is a HEPI trustee and a HEPI author. And then we've also got Andreas and Pamela, who've already been introduced and already spoken. So I'm going to ask the three panellists who haven't yet said anything just to do 5 minutes each, and I will keep it to 5 minutes because we're a bit tight for time, on their responses to what they've heard, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A to all five of them. So shall we go in the order I said? Shall we start with you, Becky?
Thanks so much, and it's a wonderful privilege to be here and to see you all this morning as well. And of course, as usual, to hear from Andreas. And as has already been said, it's a fantastic opportunity, isn't it, to hear about some of the successes, but also to challenge ourselves and to be able to really dig into that rich data which the OECD is always sharing with us, and then promoting the really important discussions in each of the nations concerned. I think it's so important to celebrate success. We don't do enough of that in our education system, I think, so that's where I want to start. That point about the support of our education system for life chances and how well we're doing in terms of access, both to level 3, but particularly to higher education, is something that we really must take away and be proud of, because the sector is all, you know, we constantly hear the negatives, don't we? We must do more, we must work harder. Those things are correct, of course. There is further to go, as came through strongly. But nevertheless, that statistic of 37% of young people whose parents didn't have level 3 qualifications themselves that go on to university in our system, compared to only a quarter of young people generally in the OECD, is something to be proud of and to galvanise us to go further, I think. And those fascinating figures around retention and completion in higher education as well. Some things are really working well in our system, and giving one another a pat on the back about that is important just occasionally. So we're hearing, really fulsomely through that slide deck about the impact of education, particularly level 3 and university education, on life chances and on remuneration. So then let's think about that pipeline. So here are my two more sort of critical pieces, and of course elements that speak to the work that I'm doing in my review of curriculum and assessment. First of all, level 3, upper secondary in OECD terms. As we've heard, it really matters. And it really matters that a large proportion of young people aren't securing, first of all, level 2, as came through strongly here, and then their life chances are particularly bad, as we saw through the slides. But also, we must look after the large group of young people that do secure level 3. They do get their 5 GCSE grade 4s and above, but they just scrape them. What has our system got to offer them? They may not be able to access A-levels, and they may not yet know exactly what they want to do, so they may not want to do a T-level. What is the clear, high-quality pathway that we offer for those young people to make sure that either they can go on to progress into university successfully or get a successful level 3 occupation? We must do more, and the review has been clear. We want to create a high-quality, clear system for those young people to deliver those outcomes for them. And then what about that high proportion of young people without even a level 2? We know that, around a third of young people every year don't secure either first of all, their maths GCSE grade 4 and above, or their English GCSE grade 4 and above. We must do better here. There's a problem clearly with how large a group that is pre-16, and then post-16. When we break it down, for example, according to social disadvantage, less than 1 in 5 young people on free school meals then go on and succeed in getting their grade 4 and above GCSE Maths and English once they're in post-16. So we are really failing those young people, and indeed only a third of young people that didn't get those GCSEs at 16 then succeed in doing so in their post-16 learning. This is not good enough. We need to narrow that group of young people, reduce that pipeline pre-16, and then we need to improve provision for them post-16. And this is something that the review is taking seriously, and I look forward to reporting on this. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Becky. I'm going to go straight to David Hughes from the AOC. David.
Brilliant. Well, I'm going to follow on from Becky, I think, because some of what you said I was going to say. I mean, I feel a bit like Boris Johnson must have felt just before the Brexit kind of stuff, when he wasn't sure whether to go Remain or Brexit. I don't know whether to go kind of like gung-ho positive about the HE system, because there's so much good stuff in there about the HE system, which is, you know, worldwide reputation, attractive, it makes a massive impact on people's lives. Or to go really negative and say, but on the other hand, there's all sorts of horrible stuff in there for people who are disadvantaged, you know, and actually that polarised position, I think, is where we normally always end up. So what I'm going to try and do is to try and kind of balance the two, really. And I think what the government, I think, has to take on board, and Jackie hinted at it, is to look at this as a whole system. And I don't think we've ever done that before. Philip Alger, when he did his report, was it 6 or 7 years ago now, talked about the tertiary system being one of, you know, investment and quality, and one and the other side being of neglect. And I think that polarisation again is the issue that shines through, Andreas, in all of what you talk about in your slides, and shine through in terms of the opportunities people miss out on because of the household they were brought up in. So change and system change is what I think we need to focus on. And what the challenge I'd like to give to all of us in the room, but also back to government, is to think about the links between the stages and phases of education, rather than to think about them as separate silos. So Jackie talked compellingly, I think, about the investment in early years. I think that's fantastic. She talked about the increased investment that the government's made in the last year in 16 to 19-year-olds in FE, and that is really positive. It doesn't quite undo 15 years of neglect, but it's starting to. But what she didn't do is to think about how the whole thing fits together. And I'm hoping, Becky, your review will do that, because what we know is if you go into school at age 5 not ready and against that test, your chances of getting good GCSEs or getting good A-levels or level 3 or getting a degree are really tiny. So it's not that we can just look at each stage separately. We have to look at the flow of people through the system. So definitely, we know, don't we, everything Becky said about GCSEs. You know, if you come from, on average, 70% get good GCSEs. Free school meals student pupils get, it's only 42%. It's a massive distinction. So no wonder wider participation and access in higher education is difficult, because actually, most of the kids who are doing well at 16 go into HE, and most of the ones who don't. But equally, Jackie, and I love Jackie, I think she was fantastic, she said lots of really good things, but what she didn't talk about was adult education and retraining. And Andreas, I think your slides show just how important that is. And if you overlay your slides with a picture of the labour market and the changing workplace, the impact of AI and technology, the need for people with poor literacy, numeracy, poor English language, poor digital skills to train, what we see is a halving of the investment in those people over the last 15 years. So we're in a really poor position if you miss out. So, you know, not only if you miss out by 16 because you're disadvantaged, but actually you stay disadvantaged throughout your life. So the NEET numbers are nearly 1 million. That's 16 to 24-year-olds. But actually the NEET numbers in your slides, again, Andreas, of 25 to 34-year-olds are still really high. So we know that there's a group of people going through the system from early years all the way through formal education into work or not work, who are disadvantaged, and nothing is changing for them. So we need more investment in the people who are missing out at every stage. In FE, I could give you all sorts of horrible figures. I won't, because you all know just how terrible FE funding is. But adult funding is the bit that really, really has been decimated, more than any other part. So we live in a world, don't we? If you do well by 16, you're probably likely to go to university, right? You've got a really, really good chance. And you get 50, 60,000 pounds of publicly supported investment for the next 3 or 4 years of your life. If you do really badly and the system fails you fail in the system, you can put that both ways, either way. The investment is paltry, and the opportunity to get back into learning, they've gone backwards in the last 15 years, and I can't see anything at the moment that's going to change that. If you're lucky, you get an employer who uses apprenticeships, but you have to be very lucky to do that. So it's a pretty difficult picture to describe, but let's not polarise it. You know, some brilliant things, but there's some terrible things as well.
Thank you, David. Bang on 5 minutes as well, which makes my life easier. Thank you, and we'll come back to some of those things, I'm sure, in the Q&A. Chris.
Well, thanks very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. When I was a child, our neighbour, who we called Auntie Margaret, would unfailingly give me a Blue Peter annual for Christmas. I always look forward to it, and the OECD Education at a Glance report has replaced the Blue Peter annual for me. I always look forward to it, and for those of a certain age, it makes Andreas into a sort of John Noakes figure. The most important line in the report is on page 112. It's this: individuals with greater educational attainment face a lower risk of unemployment and earn higher wages. Race, gender, deprivation, place all pattern that in different ways, but the overall conclusion is clear, and Andreas has now got it down to 2 words, and I think we could shout it across the road to the Treasury: education pays. That's really important. At the same time, we see divisions and challenges. First of all, advantages are inherited. If you have one tertiary educated parent, you're more than twice as likely to get a tertiary education than if your parents have got below upper secondary attainment. Life's getting better for the better qualified, and the better qualified you are, the better it's getting. Master's degrees may be the new differentiator for earnings, and if you've got a doctorate, head to Turkey. Life is getting tougher for those without qualifications. As David has just said, the figures on NEETs and the trajectory for those without basic qualifications is getting worse. To quote Andreas again, those who need it most get least out of post-school training. Education is losing the battle for public funding. Health, pensions, defence. Government spending across the OECD declined across the piece over the last 7 years. Despite this, R&D is strengthening as a driver of growth, and where it's highest, government drives it. In the UK, Israel, and Switzerland, R&D expenditure is more than twice private expenditure. Education is still the next best thing to a record deal or reality TV, but the divisions are serious and the resources are getting scarcer. Turning to England, it's an outlier in some really important respects. First, and this is a really difficult one for most of us in this room, and certainly if you work in higher education, English tertiary education is well funded by comparison with the OECD. Whatever it feels like just now, total tertiary expenditure, including R&D, David, is $35,000, amongst the highest in the OECD, and I did strip R&D out, and it still comes out at the top end of the OECD. But government tertiary expenditure in England is 48% below the OECD average. That results from high tuition fees. Our fees now 3 times the OECD average. But by comparison with the OECD, access and completion rates are high in England. It's a really complex picture. I think that leads us to 4 core challenges. First, we've got a successful and expensive system, but everywhere budgets are getting tighter. Second, gains are improving for the more highly educated, challenges intensifying for the least well qualified, and it's those people who governments are increasingly worried about for obvious political as well as economic reasons. So I think the difficulty for English higher education in all this is not so much the level of funding it receives, but the level of funding in relation to delivering what is a very high-cost operating model. And those 3 challenges define for me a leadership question. How do we reshape English higher education to preserve its strengths, but ensure that it can be more responsive and more flexible to more people, adapting higher education to a changing labour market and a society in which division and inequality are being reinforced by qualifications?
Great, fantastic. Thank you, Chris, and thank you to all the panellists. This is now the participatory bit of the morning, so I'm going to throw it open. There are 2 roving mics. There are some questions coming in online as well, so at some point I'll turn to Rose and we'll take some of those. I'm going to take questions in groups so we can get through as many as possible. I'm going to ask the panellists not to feel obliged to answer every point, only answer the ones where you've got something really interesting to say. So who would like to go first? I can see Tim O'Shea again in the front row. If you have a microphone in your hand, you use it. Okay, my colleagues will look out for you, and I can see a question towards the back as well. Tim.
So, Chris just quite correctly said that higher education needs to be more responsive and more flexible. One of the ways it's becoming less challenging has been the relative declines for the part-time higher education. We have just treated well, practice not treated well. It's that part-time and provision. The conventional universities is not being treated with. What can we do to, and it's real because God help us, Labour is dissociated the creation of the university. But what can we do to give the politicians one dime, get them to pay a bit more attention to part-time higher education, which is where we'll get more value on the access than in any other part.
Thank you, Tim. Very clear question on part-time education. I can see someone towards the back with their hand up, and if you've got, I'll take the one here with the mic first. Yeah.
Paul Baster, University of Reading. I strongly agree with panelists talking about those who've done succeed at before post-16 and also adults. My question is about STEM. If the panelists agree with me that there's an ever-increasing need for STEM skills, do you think we do enough post-16 to encourage, support, signal the importance of STEM skills, particularly mathematical, quantitative and data education?
Thank you. I'll take another one. Yeah, I'll take two more and then we'll go back to the panel. Yes, towards the back and then here. Yeah.
Hello, Vanessa Wilson from University of Science. My question relates to assessment, and what the panel asks you is whether assessment, and particularly our obsession with examinations, is whether that has caused some of the divide in our education system. Certainly, when we as University of Science were consulting with our members, it helps for us that we should therefore in an assessment review. One of the strong views back from our teaching and learning experts was that examinations and our obsession with that causes the high stakes situation in our system. And certainly with the onset of AI and all the issues that brings in the higher education system and how you assess that to ensure that you are actually testing that individuals have learned, they have the knowledge that they're supposed to. We are constantly now reviewing how we assess, particularly moving away from the examination to doing more oral assessment to really check understanding.
Thank you, Vanessa. It's taken us over an hour, I think, to mention AI, so thank you for bringing that in. It's worth it. Well, I'll take one more question. I'm going to go back to the panel. Yeah, there's one here. Oh, is there someone got a mic at the back? You ask yours and then we'll come there.
Okay, hi, Nick. Robin Gibson from Cortex. I recently got back from one of our partner institutes in the Middle East, AST in Egypt, and I was really struck by the purpose of the institution in delivering needs to the Egyptian economy. So dentists, rows and rows of dentist chairs in terms of training dentists, building a hospital on the site of one of the universities to train medics, the pharmaceutical facilities, the focus on maritime, maritime. I just wondered, I know this happens in the UK, but do we feel that we can be more focused on providing for the needs of the UK economy and therefore driving growth and inquiries via higher education, via further education?
Thank you. I'm sure the government ministers would say yes to that question. So I'll take, did you have a mic? I know there's one. Yeah, we'll just do this one here and then I really am going to go back to the panel, but sorry, you've been very patient.
Thank you. Chris Finn from Liverpool John Moores University. I was really struck by the comments on level 2, and in the city region we can see how much of a wicked problem that can be as a full stop on progression. So I'd just be interested in the panel to expand on what we feel needs to happen in the school system, and again really struck by the comments about what happens in the post school system was to happen.
Thank you. I'm told the people online haven't been able to hear all the questions, so I'm just going to very, very, very quickly recap. There was one about part-time students and whether we need to do more support for part-time learning. There was one about STEM, particularly post-16 STEM skills, so science, technology, engineering, mathematics. There was Vanessa's question about, are we too obsessed with exams, creating, which have all sorts of high stakes consequences. And then we had Robin's question, should higher education institutions be more focused on the needs of the country, the needs of the priorities of the government, etc. And then we had Chris's question on, what more could schools do? So, Andreas, don't feel you need to answer all of them, or whatever you think.
Yeah, on the question of, I don't think it's just about part-time education. I think it's in general a question of how higher education can be more responsive to very different individual needs. Giving learners greater ownership, what I learn, how I learn. What can you do? I think the credentialing system is the most powerful lever, having a more fine-grained kind of credentialing systems that gives you more choices to move into the labor market, issues like micro-credentials. I think those instruments, in the future, learning will be more and more integrated with work. So universities that offer that kind of opportunity for people to upskill and reskill have a huge advantage in the future, because the faster workplaces change, the more learning needs to be shifting from initial education to. So I think there's an absolute need for this everywhere. On the STEM question, I think there's a lot that you can do post-16. Some countries, do this through financing. University courses get there's differential financing on what universities do that is aligned with labor market needs. But actually, my reading of the UK situation is that it's largely a pre-16 question. STEM is these are very much cumulative subjects. If you've lost the train in school, it's very, very hard to get back on that. So I think that's where the pipeline, I think, really lies. And on the alignment with demand, this is unfortunately you cannot just rely on consumer choice. I mean, young people do not know the signals very well. I do think you need to ensure that the institutions have sufficient incentive to listen to how the labor market is changing and offer something to young people that makes sense for them. And I think we do too little. We rely too much on choices or on cost structures. Those are my responses.
Thank you very much, Becky. Oh, sorry. Actually, I'm going to go to Pamela next because she hasn't spoken for a while. Then I'll come to you. Sorry, Pamela.
Thank you. So I actually wanted to pick up on the question about assessment and how does that support in the age of AI. And I think there is a lot about the intensity of exams in England, and I think particularly at 16. And so I think the review that's coming out from Becky later this year, looking at that, there's an opportunity to review, question, challenge, and look at what we can do to stop young people feeling too much intensity and pressure. At the same time, I do think there's something about the role of exams in the age of AI where you've got people in an exam hall and they're not able to access AI, and how, that is something that it's one of the few places that you can't use AI to support you in your education. I think the question of how we utilize AI in education and all its advantages, but not let it take away from some of the critical factors of education around critical thinking. And I know there's a lot of debate, certainly in the tertiary sector at the moment, about how do you award a degree when the AI checkers aren't as good as we would like to be? You're not certain of how effective they are. We hear stories of professors now examining only orally rather than through assignments that are submitted to ensure students have really understood the work and can put together cogent arguments. So I think the AI piece is a much bigger one for us to explore, but I think the assessment piece, particularly at 16, we look forward to the review.
Thank you, Pamela. And Becky, will it be out before Christmas, your review?
That's certainly what we've said, and we are on target. Everything's going well.
Yes, please do.
So it's fascinating, the points that have been made about STEM and obviously alignment in terms of skills and skills building. actually we see a very strong realignment towards STEM through A-levels and other qualifications post-16, to the extent that many in the arts world and the humanities world are gravely worried about the trends that we're seeing through A-levels. English, for example, has fallen, history has fallen, and so forth. But certainly, I think it's very arguable that actually this is young people getting the message about what their opportunities are, and particularly in regard to the investment that they're making in their higher education study. So there are a whole range of different reasons and explanations that we see behind that data. And of course, there's an open question about whether these trends are hard and fast enough. But for example, we've tipped 100,000 kids every year now taking maths A-level. It's the most popular A-level. And we're seeing upticks in the sciences as well. There are, as Andreas was indicating, issues about the pipeline. It's fascinating, even my own research has contributed to the very clear explanation and trend about triple science supplying the STEM pipeline into A-level and beyond, into higher education. Why combined science isn't having the same success is an issue of concern and interest. In regard to the issue again about alignment, I think that T-levels are making a strong contribution here, very, very occupationally targeted, close work with industry and business in setting those up and developing the occupational standards. But there are issues then about sort of flexibility, there's issues about placement supply, etc., that all need to continue to be worked through. And as I've already argued, we do need to continue to protect applied generals for young people that for whatever reason can't access those routes. And then in terms of the question on level 2, which is so important, I've said that we need to secure improvements both pre-16 and post-16 here in regard to that support. I think this was for me, one of the clearest messages from the OECD at a glance this year. And in terms of, again, what the review is focusing on pre-16, we're particularly focused on momentum. There has been really good work done over the last 10, 20 years in primary, supporting young people to get those foundations in place. Often those changes have been controversial and sometimes remain so, but we've seen real improvements there. What we need to do is make sure that where there remain gaps at the end of primary, those gaps are quickly spotted and remediated. And at the moment, as we know, at Key Stage 3, early secondary, many particularly vulnerable kids start falling behind rather than maintaining that momentum through the system. So these are some of the issues that we're looking at, including, of course, qualifications in maths and English as well.
Thank you, Becky. I don't know if that was a reference to Nick Gibbs' new book, but it's worth a read on some of those primary school changes if you haven't already read it. Anyone in the room? Chris, and then David, and then we'll go to the online questions.
I'll be very brief, and I'll talk about Tim's question on part-time, not least because it enables me to trail the publication tomorrow of a report I've just finished on post-18 provision in Wakefield as a struggling former mining and industrial centre. And the challenges on part-time are multiple, partly to do with the cost and flexibility of provision, so there's the cost, of course, but also to do with the lived experience of people in accessing that. So there's living costs, there's transport costs, there's actually getting under the skin of that. And it's an area where clearly the market as we have it has not succeeded. And we're talking about how you can begin to build the market in a very different way. So I'm not going to give anything more away, but I am going to ask you to all tune into the Wakefield Futures Commission launch tomorrow morning. But getting that right, I think, is part of how you get a much more flexible HE system and much more porosity between FE and HE.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, I mean, just build on that. I mean, I think the part-time issue is about place, isn't it? So what we need is behaviour change in employers. Employers need to send signals to the market, create a market for level 4, 5, create a market for modules, because we've got a labour market that's a bit lazy, I think. You can put out, and have been able to put out, an advert saying we want a graduate, and by graduate we always mean a 3-year residential degree, don't we, in this country, for some strange reason. And there have been loads of them. But actually, that's slowed down. What we need is more adults who have not benefited from a 3-year degree or a master's, as Chris said earlier, to have the opportunity to do modules. The LLE is a good idea, but it will take an enormous amount of work to create the market, to create the demand. And it's employer behaviour that where we really need to focus, get them understanding what are the qualifications at level 4 or 5, what are the modules that will help them improve their productivity. On the level 2 issue, I mean, I've been told off too many times because I'm really into thinking and talking about young people's motivation. And I think lots of young people get incredibly turned off in Key Stage 3 and in Key Stage 4. The GCSE curriculum feels incredibly arcane. They don't know why they're doing trigonometry or literature. What they actually want, and when you talk to them, and all the polling shows, is they want a pathway to a good job. So my view on, and we've talked to the review about this and put in submissions, is fine, keep with GCSEs as the so-called gold standard. I personally don't think that's the right thing to do, but there's not time to go into that. But let's just do something different, can't we, with some young people? So I was in Sunderland College a couple of weeks ago, or a couple of months ago. They've got a fantastic partnership with Nissan. They've got kids aged 14 and 15 from local schools doing day release in the college, learning engineering supported by Nissan. It's incredibly popular and it's incredibly successful. It engages and motivates young people. The outcomes are most of those young people do engineering at the college at level 3, or they go into Nissan to do an apprenticeship. Most of them, yeah. We need more of that, and we need to make it an entitlement that people apply for and kind of aspire to, not a dumping ground for the kids who haven't done very well. And I think if you do more of that, we'll get more motivation of some of the kids who are just going, what's the point?
Thank you, David. I slightly feel for policymakers here because I think there's almost unanimity among the panel that employer-focused education is very valuable and very wanted by learners. But of course, politicians get accused of not caring about education for education's sake when they make speeches to those ends. But that's just a thought. Rose, I think you're garnering some questions from the online viewers. Can you go rattle through them?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions for you here. One for quite Margaret, who would like to know the panel's thoughts on whether marrying skills with work pensions will have implications for the funding of colleges and universities post-18 education. And a question from the National Centre for Entrepreneurship in Education, which says, the OECD report states that investment in R&D at the tertiary level is a key driver of long-term economic growth and competitiveness. And there will be inconsistent here reflections on countries that do that well.
Thank you, Rose. I'm going to take, because we lose Andreas at 15:15 because he's due, I don't know which country, but you're catching
Ukraine.
a flight, I think. Ukraine? Oh, wow. So
It's the train, it's only one.
Right, yes. And so we must let Andreas go bang on 15:15. So are there any other questions in the room? There's a couple here. I'll take these two and then I'll go back to the panel.
Thank you. Tony Moss from London South Bank University. On sort of extending the question around demand, I've recently had calls to start fishing around, looking at some of the data around the apprenticeship training rates and how that aligns with some of the skills gaps we've got. One very specific one, there were lots of examples, it's of welders. In about 2 years' time, there'd be about 30,000 welders short in this country. There are standards being offered by about 80 different providers at level 2, 3 and 4, who over the past 5 years have managed to train about 2,500 welders. So the reason I mention that is that on that question of demand, I think there's a lot more that we could do. I'm not hearing policy and a lot of wider discussions. What are we actually doing to convince people to go and do the things that we as a country would want them to do? Because the problem isn't about supply. There are providers out there offering these programs. We just don't have the numbers coming through to meet the need nationally.
Thank you, Tony.
Hello, Viggo Stacey from QS here. I think online still can't hear these questions, just so you know. I've got quite a wide question, and it's we've got some really good educational reporters. I know Amy's here in the group from the FT, and we've got some online that join as well. But it's sort of about widening access, and also David was talking about influencing the Treasury across the road, but whether higher education has a PR problem.
Okay, thank you. I saw Lord Willet's got his hand up again, and I saw Johnny Rich. So I'm going to take their two questions. If I could ask them just to be brief, so that there's time for the panel to respond to them. But David.
There's a very strong theme of 16 to 18-year-olds, which is where I think there are crucial difficulties. Andreas made a point that he thought 15-year-olds had a very poor sense of the link between their aspirations and possible jobs. Could he say a bit more on that? Becky referred to 16-year-olds who weren't suited for a T-level because they hadn't yet decided what kind of job they wanted to make. That seems to me a wider critique of specialisation. And is that going to be a theme in your review on the 16 to 18-year-olds? And will the other panel as well have practical proposals to reduce the number of NEETs, particularly in the earlier range?
Thank you. And then Johnny.
Thank you. As Andres referenced, consumer choice is basically the driver of supply of education, particularly higher education and further education, rather than the employer or economic need. How could we better link the supply of higher education to economic need, rather than just employers saying, I want more?
Thank you.
For level 4. And are there any countries that do it really well?
Thank you. Right, I'm going to call a halt. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question. There is drinks afterwards, so Andreas will have left, but other people may be mingling around, and you can put your questions to them. So I really want to give Andreas the final word, but that will only work if the panellists are all quite brief in response to those multiple questions around skills being with DWP, about entrepreneurship in education, about welders, supply, etc. David's questions about 16 to 18 and 15-year-old, their roots, and Johnny, and a question about PR. So do not answer all of them, but we'll go down the pack. David.
Yeah, three really quick ones then. I mean, DWP is going to bring thousands of millions to FE and change everything. That's kind of, we've got to be optimistic, haven't we? And we've got to believe in it. We'll see. I mean, I think the welders question is a really important one. My question always with this is, what are the welders of next year doing today, and what's the journey they need to take? And it's a really, really important question. I think there'd be lots of people would love to be a welder. You can get 50 grand a year on a nuclear site quite easily from a level 2 qualification. The return on investment is massive. But the problem is that welder of tomorrow is an Uber driver today, or working in hospitality or retail. They need some support to live and pay for food while they're training, and they can't get it. And it is really, really simple. Let's open up those opportunities to get some benefits and get some training to fill those jobs. On NEET, David, I mean, just really one simple one, and it is about money. There are colleges now turning young people away at age 16 because there is no guarantee that they will get the funding from government to pay for their learning. So I was at Exeter College last week on the first day of term. They've taken 700 extra learners at risk, unfunded learners, 700 at risk, hoping that the government will give them some money to pay for it. And they've turned away 300 because they had to balance the risk with what they're doing. It's an outrageous situation, and no university or school will ever be in that position. They can take as many as they want and they'll be funded to do it. We need to change that because colleges literally are turning away young people who are the NEET numbers of tomorrow, and there is no youth guarantee because of that.
Thank you. Pamela.
I'm just going to pick up on the couple of questions around tertiary level, the consumer choice and the investment in R&D, and just to highlight again the international student piece around tertiary and the fact that we are clearly still doing something really well in the UK in tertiary education, that we are the second most attractive destination overall for international students, and that we are still seeing this growth trajectory for that in comparison to the US. And just reminding ourselves of the benefits that international students do bring to our economy, some 42 billion a year. And there was a really interesting report out last week from the All-Party Parliamentary Group for International Students that was looking that for every 1 million of revenue that was being brought in locally in this country, we were seeing between 2.3 and 2.5 million in local economic output. And actually, in something like 26 parliamentary constituencies, higher education is now actually their largest export, and it's in the top 3 for 100 constituencies. And so it's just reminding ourselves that we are doing something positive. And I recently came across a quote from a Home Secretary from many, many years ago, in the 80s, I think it was, which was reminding us that international mobility of students is one of the foundation stones of a peaceful, stable and interdependent world. So that's something that we are doing well here, and we should remind ourselves.
Thank you. I'm going to go, I am going to go to Becky and Chris, but I'm actually going to go to Andreas next, just in case, Andreas, you do need to. I suspect that ping might be in your taxi. So, Andreas, I'm going to go to you next.
Yeah, a couple of things. The R&D piece is very important. It's very hard to compare across countries simply because the role of universities in the R&D sectors varies a lot. You have the UK, where universities are a big player in this. You take the United States, where much of that same function is performed by private industry. So it's very hard. But what you can generally see is that those future-related investments are huge drivers of long-term progress. And this is always a risk, you know, that those functions get reduced, that higher education just focuses on a supply of graduates. The question on, you know, how do you make, you know, more applied learning first choice, not a last resort, is really difficult. And to some extent, you know, it has to do with the signaling of higher education, but it also is reflected in earnings. I mean, we must basically, employment prospects are actually really, really good. If you go through an alternative route, you often have better employment prospects than someone who goes through the academic route. But when it comes to long-term earnings, the picture is not as rosy. And often, you know, the lines cross at age 40, 45 in our data. And in the long run, you know, a more kind of narrow focus has greater risk. And getting those kind of risks and benefits more clearly articulated, I think, is very important. But you look at countries like Switzerland, they're amazingly good at all of this. You know, in those systems, you as a young person have lots of really interesting pathways at similar esteem, and many young people actually choose the more applied pathways, not as a kind of lower level of occupation, but just as a very different way of learning. The question on, you know, aspiration is a really, you know, a tricky one. If you look at the UK, about 50% of the 15-year-olds from PISA aspire to only 10 jobs. Half of your young people only see a future, and many of those jobs are jobs of the past, not jobs of the future. And a lot of this has to do with experience. You know, school usually gives you those kinds of experiences, and, you know, as they say, you cannot be what you do not see. If you do not have those kind of people in front of you, and there are two aspects I want to bring into this. One is gender, and the other is social background. One of the most depressing data points from PISA is you take a student from a wealthy background and one from a disadvantaged background with the same top level of STEM performance. You know, take them from the top decile of student performance on the PISA test. And you'll see that despite the fact that both are equally talented, those from the privileged background see higher education as their futures about 6 times more likely than those from the disadvantaged. This is not about their performance. This is not about access or financial resources. This is simply about the world that young people see for themselves. And if we cannot change that, many of disparities will not be diminished.
Well, thank you so much, Andreas. I'm about to go to Chris and Becky, but I know your taxi is waiting outside, and I don't want Zelensky on HEPI's back for delaying your travel to Ukraine. So perhaps just before we go to Chris and Becky and Andreas, if you want to creep out, you're obviously very welcome to. Perhaps we could just thank Andreas for his very detailed presentation. It's been wonderful to be part of hosting you again, Andreas, along with, obviously, Cambridge University Press and Assessments. So, Chris. Chris. Yeah, thank you, Andreas.
Ever so quickly, I really worry about the neat figures. I'm not decrying that. But on the as I did more and more work on the Wakefield project, I became more and more concerned, not by the flow, but by the stock. The significant number of 18 to 64-year-olds with low skills, poor labour market outcomes. And when you talk to those people, we did a lot of focus group work, a lot of survey work, it is not a problem of aspiration. It is not a problem of motivation. It is a problem of availability and access and routes. And we have to crack that, because we can't write off the adults who are currently some distance from the qualifications and labour market system and wait for the flow to solve the problem. And that I feel more and more strongly about the longer I go on.
Thank you. I'm not sure we've completely addressed Lord Willits' question on sort of early specialisation, have we? Is there anything you want to say on that? Or maybe Becky will solve that in her curriculum review.
I'll just start with the brilliant question: has HE got a PR problem? I mean, yes, patently, HE does have a very severe PR problem, because it's a huge employer locally and nationally. We have the best system in the world after the United States. It's, as I said, contributing to local and national economies, as well as enriching young people's lives in so many different ways, materially, as we've heard today, but in many other ways as well. But the very fact that practically half of young people are coming through the system, and yet the public aren't aware of these benefits, shows how deep that PR problem is. Moving on to the specialisation question. No, I think if you look at our interim report, we're quite clear that we're very supportive, actually, of the A-level system, which is very well understood, very successful in terms of succeeding to channel. I think it's about 85% of young people that are doing A-levels succeed and move on into higher education. Questions, of course, as to whether it would be useful for them to have a little bit more, breadth and so forth. But actually, there's no evidence that for our 3-year, as David said, the mainstay of our tertiary offer, that this actually doesn't support young people well to thrive. And indeed, all the data that we've heard today suggests that it does. However, certainly, I'm talking about university here. At age 16, I'd ask anyone in the audience, did you know exactly what you wanted to do at age 16? I most certainly didn't. Did I know at age 23? Probably not. The point is that we need to support young people to keep their options open. And as we've heard across the panel and from Andreas as well, those options, when we think about master's level and so forth, are increasingly becoming the domain of the privileged. We must stand against that. We must enable young people to to be able to move up that pipeline from level 2 to level 3 into then either successful level 3 occupation or higher education study, keeping their options open so that they have choice. And this mustn't become the purview of the privileged.
Well, thank you so much including for ending on something, a sort of constructive recommendation, and a few hints about your review. So I'm going to call the formal proceedings to a halt. There is tea and coffee and biscuits and whatnot next door, and there'll be we will be supplying more than there is demand because of the number of people who moved from in-person attendance to online attendance. So snaffle some biscuits for your office as well if you want to, if you're going back there. I want to end really by thanking all sorts of people. You've heard from lots of people, including, of course, Andreas, including the Minister, including all our wonderful panellists, David and Pamela and Chris and Becky. I want to thank Cambridge University Press and Assessments. An event like this is not cheap to put on. It's beyond HEPI's ability to do on its own. We simply couldn't have done it without the support of Cambridge University Press and Assessment. And indeed, we learn a lot from that partnership we have with them because of their incredible expertise in all the areas Pamela's been talking about, and indeed beyond. I also want to thank my colleagues. Emma's done a huge amount of the arrangements today, as has Carol, as has Lucy, who was very important in ensuring we managed to co-host it with Cambridge University Press and Assessment, to Rose as well. And then finally to you for battling your way through, despite the RMT's best efforts to stop you being here, for coming here. And obviously to Andreas and his colleagues as well. There were a whole bunch of people at the OECD who helped us put this on. We will, I think Andreas will let us do it. We'll put his slides up on the HEPI website later today. We've recorded the session. It'll be on our YouTube channel. So if you want to look back at anything, I don't know if our panelists can hang around. I hope they can for a quick cup of coffee if you didn't get to your question. But apart from that, thank you for coming and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.